Barron Trump pretends to be a poor homeless boy. The governor's reaction ends his career. The city streets were bustling with life, as always. Businessmen in tailored suits marched with purpose, coffee in hand, while tourists admired the towering buildings. Amid the crowd, a teenage boy sat on the cold pavement, his eyes fixed on the ground. His once clean clothes were now wrinkled and dirted, and his backpack lay beside him, worn and torn. This boy was none other than Barron Trump. But today, he wasn't the well-dressed son of a former president. Today, he was just another invisible figure among the homeless youth scattered across the city. Barron wasn't doing this for attention or sympathy. It was a personal experiment, a lesson he'd set for himself. He had seen far too many stories of the less fortunate being mistreated and ignored. What would happen if he stepped into their shoes for a day? How would people treat him? He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to understand the world from a different perspective. The cold breeze blew through the streets, sending a shiver down his spine. He hugged his knees closer to his chest, trying to keep warm. People walked by, some giving him a fleeting glance, others pretending he didn't exist at all. He felt the sting of rejection every time someone passed him without a word, but he stayed put, observing and waiting. Minutes turned into hours. His stomach growled, and the ache in his back from sitting on the hard pavement grew unbearable. Just as he considered giving up, an older man in a tailored suit stopped in front of him. The man looked down at him, disgust evident in his eyes. "What are you doing here, kid?" the man asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're loitering. Move along before you cause trouble." Barron looked up at him, trying his best to maintain his character. "I have nowhere else to go," he said softly. "I just need a place to rest." The man scoffed. "You homeless kids are all the same, always looking for handouts. Do you even try to help yourselves? Or do you just sit here and expect the world to take pity on you?" The harsh words stung, but Barron held his ground. "I'm not looking for handouts. Just a little understanding," he replied, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his throat. The man leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "Let me tell you something, boy. People like you are a burden on this city. If it were up to me, I'd clean these streets and make sure none of you hung around here. You're just a stain on what could be a prosperous place." Barron felt his pulse quicken. He hadn't expected kindness from everyone, but this level of cruelty shocked him. Still, he kept his cool. "I don't want to be a burden," he said calmly. "I'm just trying to survive." But the man wasn't listening. He shook his head in disgust and turned to leave. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath. Barron watched him walk away, a mix of anger and sadness brewing inside him. The experience was more than he had bargained for, but he knew he couldn't stop now. He wanted to see how deep the indifference went, and just how many people would show their true colors when they thought no one was watching. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. The streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow on the pavement. Just when Barron thought his experiment couldn't get worse, another man in a suit approached. This one looked familiar, almost too familiar. It was Governor Samuel Harper, a powerful and well-known figure in the city, known for his tough stance on homelessness and his controversial policies. The governor stopped in front of Barron, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the young boy sitting on the sidewalk. He crossed his arms, an unimpressed smirk playing on his lips. "Another lost cause," Harper said with a chuckle. "You know, boys like you should be in a shelter, or better yet, learning some discipline in a program. But no, you choose to waste your time here, begging for attention." Barron raised his head, locking eyes with the governor. His heart raced, but he refused to back down. And what if there isn't a shelter with room? What if there aren't enough programs to help all of us? Harper laughed, a hollow sound that sent chills down Barron's spine. "That's not my problem, is it? You see, we give you people plenty of chances, but you never take them. Instead, you stay out here, lowering the city's image. If I had my way, we'd clean the streets entirely." Barron clenched his fists, fighting the urge to speak out. But he knew he couldn't reveal his true identity, not yet. He needed to stay in character and see how far this man's arrogance and cruelty would go. Sometimes life just happens," Barron said softly. "Not everyone chooses to be here." The governor shook his head. Spare me the sob story, kid. People who want to get out of this life will find a way. The rest of you? You're just lazy. Barron felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice steady. Maybe you should spend a day in our shoes, Governor. You might learn something. The governor sneered. I don't need to learn anything from you. I've worked hard for what I have. People like you just make excuses. Barron watched as the governor walked away, his chest tightening with frustration. This man was supposed to be a leader, someone who cared about the people in his city. Instead, he was filled with judgment and hatred for those less fortunate. Barron knew he had to do something big, to expose the truth about this man. Barron sat in silence, replaying the governor's words in his head. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was a mission to uncover the truth about how people in power treated those they deemed invisible. He needed to document everything, every word, every action, every cruel dismissal. As night fell, the city grew quieter. The once crowded streets were now deserted, except for a few late-night wanderers. Barron decided it was time to take his plan to the next level. He pulled out a small hidden camera from his pocket, adjusting it discreetly on his jacket. If the governor returned, Barron would capture his true nature on film. The following day, Barron returned to the same spot, prepared for whatever might come. He noticed a few familiar faces passing by, businesspeople who had ignored him the day before. This time, he wasn't just watching, he was recording. Each encounter felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing how indifferent society could be to those struggling around them. Just as the afternoon's sun reached its peak, the governor appeared once again. This time, he was accompanied by several aides and a photographer. Barron quickly realized what was happening, a publicity stunt. Harper was about to pose for photos, pretending to care for the homeless. The governor walked over to Barron, his expression suddenly softening. "Young man," he said, loud enough for the cameras to capture, "I want you to know that we're here to help. No one in this city should feel forgotten." Barron's jaw tightened. The hypocrisy was almost too much to bear. "Help," he repeated, his voice calm but pointed. "You said yesterday that people like me are a burden." The governor's smile faltered for a split second before he quickly recovered. "I'm sorry if I gave you that impression," he said, patting Barron on the shoulder. "Sometimes words are taken out of context." Barron raised an eyebrow. "I recorded our conversation. Would you like me to play it back?" The governor's face paled, and the aides exchanged nervous glances. "There's no need for that," Harper said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Why don't we discuss this privately?" Barron stood, meeting the governor's gaze. "No need for privacy, Governor. I think the people deserve to hear how you really feel." A crowd had started to gather, curious about the confrontation. Barron pulled out his phone and played the recording. The harsh words Harper had spoken the day before echoed through the street, sending shockwaves through the onlookers. The governor's expression hardened. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, trying to maintain his composure. "You're twisting my words." The crowd wasn't buying it. Whispers of disapproval spread like wildfire, and someone in the back shouted, "Resign, Harper. We don't need leaders like you." Barron felt a surge of confidence. "It's not just about what you said to me," he continued. "It's about how you treat people who don't have the same opportunities. You've turned a blind eye to those who need help the most. You judge without knowing their stories." The governor took a step back, his eyes darting around for an escape. "This is absurd," he muttered. "We're leaving." As Harper and his team retreated, the crowd erupted in boos. Barron watched them disappear down the street, a sense of victory washing over him. But he knew the fight wasn't over. The recording had gone viral within minutes, shared across social media platforms with captions condemning the governor's actions. The next morning, news outlets were buzzing with the story. Headlines read, "Governor Harper's hypocrisy exposed by homeless teen and public outrage builds after viral confrontation." Reporters scrambled to get interviews with Barron, eager to hear his side of the story. He decided to make a statement, standing on the same street corner where it all began. "I'm not really homeless," he began, addressing the cameras. "But there are thousands of people in this city who are. People who are ignored, judged, and mistreated every single day. I wanted to experience their world firsthand, and what I found was heartbreaking. He paused, scanning the crowd. This isn't about me. It's about the people who don't have a voice. It's about holding our leaders accountable for their words and actions. No one should be treated the way I was, and no one should have to prove their worth just to be seen. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own experiences and calling for change. Protests were organized, demanding better support for the homeless community and greater accountability from city officials. Governor Harper tried to issue a public apology, but it was too late. His words fell on deaf ears. The people had made up their minds. Within days, an official investigation was launched into his administration's policies, and pressure mounted for him to step down. Barron watched it all unfold with a mix of relief and determination. He hadn't expected his experiment to have such a powerful impact, but he was grateful it did. The experience had changed him forever, opening his eyes to a world he had only glimpsed from a distance. Barron spent the next few days observing the aftermath of his confrontation with Governor Harper. News stations couldn't stop replaying the clip of their encounter, and social media was buzzing with calls for action. People shared stories of their own struggles with homelessness, demanding that the governor be held accountable. The streets that had once felt cold and indifferent were now alive with solidarity and support. Despite the chaos, Barron knew there was still more work to be done. He decided to focus his efforts on meeting real homeless individuals and learning their stories. Armed with nothing more than a notepad and his phone, he walked through different neighborhoods, speaking to anyone willing to share their experiences. One afternoon, he met an older man named Thomas sitting on a park bench. His face was weathered and his clothes were tattered, but his eyes sparkled with wisdom. "You're the boy from the video," Thomas said, smiling. "You caused quite a stir." Barron chuckled. "I guess I did. But it wasn't just about the governor, it's about all the people he ignored." Thomas nodded. "You've got a good heart, kid. Most people walk past us like we're invisible. But you..." He paused, searching for the right words. "You see us?" They talked for hours, with Thomas recounting his life before he lost his home. He had once been a successful carpenter, building homes for others before an injury left him unable to work. Medical bills piled up, and eventually he found himself on the streets. Barron listened intently, his heart aching at every detail. "That's not fair," he said softly. "You deserve better." Thomas shrugged. "Life isn't always fair. But it doesn't mean we stop trying." Inspired by Thomas's resilience, Barron decided to use his platform to amplify the voices of those he met. He recorded interviews, sharing their stories on social media with the hashtag #InvisibleNoMore. Within days, the movement gained traction, with thousands of people rallying behind the cause. The pressure on Governor Harper continued to mount. His past policies were scrutinized, and journalists uncovered numerous instances of neglect and corruption. It wasn't long before the governor announced his resignation, citing personal reasons. But everyone knew the real reason: he had been exposed. Barron's experiment had grown into something much bigger than he had anticipated. What started as a simple test had turned into a full-blown movement for change. He received messages of support from people all over the country, students, activists, and even celebrities. But through it all, Barron remained focused on the people he had met. He returned to Thomas's park bench one afternoon, carrying a bag of fresh food and supplies. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, handing Thomas a sandwich. Thomas chuckled. "I didn't do much, kid. You were the one brave enough to stand up." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the world go by. For the first time in a long while, Barron felt truly at peace. He had found his purpose, not in wealth or fame, but in using his privilege to help those who needed it most. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, Barron made a silent promise to himself. This was only the beginning. There were still countless stories waiting to be told, and he would make sure the world heard every single one. In the weeks that followed, Barron launched a foundation dedicated to supporting homeless individuals and advocating for policy change. He worked closely with local shelters, ensuring that resources were directed to those who needed them most. The movement continued to grow, fueled by the stories of resilience and hope that Barron shared. Thomas became one of the foundation's first employees, using his skills to help rebuild shelters and mentor others. "You're changing lives, Barron," he said one day, watching volunteers work on a new project. "Including mine?" Barron smiled. "No, Thomas. We're changing lives together." As the foundation grew, Barron found himself dedicating more time to understanding the systemic issues that kept people on the streets. His research revealed how little resources were being allocated to shelters and social programs, despite the wealth of the state. Determined to make a deeper impact, he started meeting with city officials, pushing for changes in local policies. His young age and recognizable face became an advantage. People listened when he spoke. But change didn't come without resistance. Some political leaders viewed him as a threat, an outsider stirring up trouble. The media began to spin conflicting narratives. Some hailed him as a hero, while others painted him as a privileged teenager playing a game with serious consequences. Barron remained unfazed. He knew the truth was on his side, and that truth had a way of shining through. One day, he received an invitation to speak at a televised town hall. It was a rare opportunity to address the public directly, alongside city officials and advocates for homelessness reform. As he stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak, Barron felt a rush of nerves. But then he glanced at the small crowd that had gathered, faces of people he had met in shelters, their eyes filled with hope and encouragement. He stepped up to the podium and took a deep breath. "I didn't come here today as a political figure or an expert," he began. "I came here as someone who has seen what happens when we turn a blind eye to suffering, when we ignore those who need our help the most." His voice grew stronger as he recounted the stories of the people he had met. Mothers who had lost their homes due to skyrocketing rents, veterans left without support, and children who grew up without a place to call home. He spoke of Thomas's journey and the countless others who deserved a second chance. "We can't change the past," Barron concluded, "but we can change the future. We can choose to see each other, to lift each other up instead of looking the other way. And that change starts here, today, with all of us." The room erupted into applause. Cameras flashed, and reporters scribbled notes. Barron felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to the people in power to act. In the following weeks, the momentum continued to build. The state government announced a series of new initiatives aimed at expanding affordable housing and increasing funding for mental health services and addiction recovery programs. Barron was invited to sit on advisory boards, helping shape policies from the inside. His foundation received an outpouring of support, allowing them to open new shelters and provide vocational training for those seeking a fresh start. Thomas, now thriving in his new role, became a mentor to others in the program. He worked tirelessly, teaching carpentry and encouraging others to find their purpose. "You were right, kid," he said one day, watching as a group of newly trained carpenters worked on a community project. "We can build something beautiful out of the broken pieces." Barron smiled. "We've only just begun, Thomas." But not everything was smooth sailing. There were still setbacks, unexpected challenges, and moments of doubt. Some policies took longer to pass than expected, and not everyone welcomed change with open arms. Yet, for every obstacle, Barron found strength in the community he had helped build. One evening, he returned to the park bench where he had first met Thomas. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city. A group of children played nearby, their laughter filling the air. For a moment, Barron let himself pause, taking it all in. He thought of how far they had come and how much more there was to do. His phone buzzed with a message, a woman from a nearby shelter thanking him for helping her find housing for her family. Barron typed a quick response, promising to visit the shelter soon. As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, he looked out at the city skyline, a determined smile on his face. This was his life now, not one of privilege and isolation, but of purpose and connection. And as long as there were stories left to tell, people left unheard, he would be there, ready to listen, ready to act. Barron knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. But with every step forward, he was reminded of the power of compassion, the strength of community, and the incredible things that could happen when someone refused to stay silent. And in that quiet moment on the park bench, surrounded by a city that was slowly learning to care, Barron made a silent vow. He would keep fighting no matter what. For Thomas. For the countless others still waiting to be seen. And for a world that was just beginning to wake up to its potential to change. The impact of Barron's speech resonated far beyond the town hall. Social media buzzed with clips from the event, showing the poised and passionate young man standing firm in his message. His words became a rallying cry for change, spreading through news outlets, reaching millions of viewers, and sparking a national conversation about homelessness and corruption in local politics. But while the public embraced Barron's message, it sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Governor Whitaker, in particular, found himself in an uncomfortable spotlight. Questions began to surface about how the state's budget had been allocated under his administration. Investigative reporters started digging deeper, exposing years of mismanagement and funds that had mysteriously gone unaccounted for. Initially, the governor dismissed the accusations as baseless rumors. He held press conferences, flanked by advisors, confidently denying any wrongdoing. "This is nothing more than a smear campaign," he said with a forced smile. "I have dedicated my career to public service and have always acted in the best interest of this state." But the evidence told a different story. Records of misallocated funds were unearthed, showing large sums diverted away from social programs and into questionable projects that benefited private interests. Public outrage swelled as more details emerged. Meanwhile, Barron remained focused on his work, determined to let the truth speak for itself. "We're not here to tear anyone down," he told a group of volunteers at his foundation. "We're here to build something better, something lasting." But the tide was turning rapidly. Protests erupted outside the state capitol, with demonstrators demanding Governor Whitaker's resignation. Signs reading justice for the homeless and accountability now filled the streets. Feeling the pressure, Governor Whitaker attempted to turn the narrative back in his favor. He called a press conference, inviting Barron to meet him on stage for a public reconciliation to show unity. Barron reluctantly agreed, knowing it was a carefully crafted political move. Still, he saw it as an opportunity to speak directly to the people once more. The day of the press conference arrived. Cameras lined the steps of the Capitol building as the governor greeted Barron with a forced handshake. "It's an honor to have you here," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. Barron nodded politely but kept his focus. As the governor launched into a speech filled with vague promises and empty reassurances, Barron waited patiently for his turn to speak. When the microphone was finally handed to him, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I appreciate the opportunity to be here," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But let's not pretend this is about me. This is about the thousands of people who have been forgotten, left behind by a system that was supposed to protect them." The crowd listened intently as Barron outlined the specific policies that needed to change, calling on the state government to prioritize affordable housing, mental health services, and job training programs. His words were measured but powerful, cutting through the political theater and speaking directly to the hearts of those watching. Governor Whitaker's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he glanced nervously at his advisors. He hadn't expected Barron to be so composed, so unrelenting. Then came the question that changed everything. A reporter raised her hand, her voice steady but pointed. "Governor Whitaker, given the mounting evidence of misallocated funds and your history of blocking affordable housing initiatives, do you still believe you've acted in the best interest of your constituents?" The governor froze, his confident demeanor evaporating in an instant. The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing every flicker of panic. He stammered, searching for an answer, but none came. Barron stepped back, giving the governor the floor, but it was clear to everyone present that the damage had already been done. The press conference ended abruptly, with the governor quickly retreating from the podium. Headlines exploded across news outlets. Governor Whitaker exposed, young advocate calls for accountability, and a new voice for justice. In the days that followed, the pressure became unbearable. An ethics investigation was launched, uncovering even more damning evidence. Within weeks, Governor Whitaker announced his resignation, citing personal reasons. His political career, once seemingly unshakable, crumbled under the weight of the truth. For Barron, the governor's downfall was never the goal. He felt no sense of victory, only relief that the system had finally begun to correct itself. But he also knew there was still so much work to be done. The resignation sparked a wave of reforms. New leaders stepped up, vowing to prioritize the needs of the community. Policies that had been stalled for years were suddenly passed with overwhelming support. Barron's foundation became a symbol of what was possible when people refused to stay silent. Despite the newfound recognition and praise, Barron remained grounded. He continued to visit shelters and community centers, listening to the stories of those he sought to help. Thomas often accompanied him, sharing his own experiences and offering hope to those who felt trapped by their circumstances. One afternoon, as they stood in front of a newly built shelter, Thomas turned to Barron with a smile. "You really did it, kid," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You changed the game." Barron shook his head. "We did it, Thomas. And we're just getting started."